Welcome to this episode of the People Data for Good podcast. I'm Al Adamsen, and in this episode, I had the great pleasure of talking with Jared Valdron. Jared is one of the most creative people analytics leaders I've had the pleasure of coming across. He has been at Google, and namely, he created the capability at GitHub, and he has his own project, which I'll let him talk about. It's a fascinating discussion that covers everything from data aggregation, analysis, distribution, to being aware of biases. So without further ado, here's my talk with Jared. Hi, welcome, Jared. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Al?
I'm doing great as well, and it's great to be talking with you. I know that you're in transition. You're on a move to Austin, but you're here in the Bay Area for the time being. So, if you would please introduce yourself and a little bit about how you got in the field of people analytics.
Yeah, no worries at all. And yeah, it's a big time of transition. It's been a great time of reflection as well, around sort of where I've been, where I've come from, all that kind of good stuff. So yeah, I'm Jared, and I often describe myself as a people data generalist. I do a little bit of everything and have my fun. I always say I can do 80% of what you need to be done, in all places. But once you want a specialist, that's a good time to start building out the function. So how I got into this space, I sort of have a pretty long meandering journey. Um, I was actually born in Canada, in far east coast in sort of a maritime kind of region, a place called New Brunswick, and it was a great incubation environment for me. And at the same time, though, I didn't get too much exposure to what different career paths were out there. So for the longest time, I actually thought I was going to be a physicist or a scientist because that's what I had exposure to, and I had a wide variety of experiences around that, and I kept on feeling this experience where I kept on thinking, okay, I love physics and science, but I also was always had this sort of this interest in the social sciences and in people. And I took a great AP psychology course, and I always felt myself drawn there to the point that I kept on believing, oh, I'm going to be a physicist by day, and then I'm going to be a social scientist by night. I'm just going to run experiments in bars. And at some point in my university, I thought, wow, if I'm willing to do that in my spare time, that'd be pretty fun to do as a job. So I went through a wide variety of experiences. I had the great opportunity to work at Harvard for a summer doing research on unconscious bias. And something I learned was that every time I was doing research, I always kept on being drawn towards the application of science to work, and psychology to work. And that really drove me to think about what do I want to do. And I ended up doing graduate school in industrial organizational psychology. But even there, I kept on feeling like a lot of the work that was happening for me was a little bit too academic, and a little bit separate from practice. And that's where I actually got in touch with some folks from Google. So I actually don't know how many people know this story, but my first real exposure to people analytics was that Google, for the Rework conference, had this special kind of application for emerging researchers to present some of their research, and I applied. And I did a super stereotypical video showing sort of snow in the background, being in Canada, and I ended up getting in. And through that, I really learned, wow, there's so many really passionate, smart people working on this, in Silicon Valley, and I really saw a different path than I saw before around what I could realistically do with my career and my life. And that sort of drove me towards people analytics. I ended up doing a lot of consulting around that. And from there, I ended up joining my gig at GitHub, where I built the people analytics from the ground up, and had so much fun. I've left recently, but GitHub will always have a really special part in my heart.
Well, you have done some amazing work. I've had the privilege of hearing about it firsthand at our events over the years. One of the things that's always struck me is that you have the not only passion, but you have the ability to actually create new products. It's long been said that, hey, we can do research, but what's going to be sustainable, what's
Mm,
going to stick around beyond the person who's actually putting this all together. And not to get ahead of ourselves, because I know you're working on developing products, but can you just share your philosophy, and particularly around that point, the people analytics function building capability as opposed to doing research behind a you know behind a curtain somewhere?
for sure. I think, at the end of the day, your role in people analytics is to, serve the organization. And there's a lot of things that are really exciting for research that might not have much practical application. The joke I always like to give is, if you ask a whole bunch of people about how they feel about their salary and you have no intention of changing their salary, that might be interesting for research, but you're not going to lead to a business decision or a business outcome. I think, for my philosophy, I think, personally, and this is, related to my professional, but I think that I don't like to do the same thing more than three times in a manual way. And that's sort of it's this thing that happens in my head where I realize, okay, can this process be automated? The story I like to tell is even I got a new manager at GitHub, and I used to run one-on-ones with Google Sheets, or sorry, with Google Docs. And the thing with Google Docs is that automatically when you add something new, it's going to push down the content before. But a new manager wanted to work with Google Sheets, and there was this new element of friction in that you needed to have I need to manually add 7 or 8 rows each individual time, and these sort of common kind of labels to that one-on-one. And even that was a little bit too much friction for me. So I actually learned that with Google Sheets, you can write Google Apps scripts, and you can automate that process to add 10 lines with this kind of label on a certain timer. So that's just a quick example of, you know, me trying to solve for myself in a lot of ways. Me seeing, okay, here are some things that I'm doing manually. Is there a way that this could be automated? And I always like to say is that, even at GitHub, one of my major goals when I was leaving the company, and even as I thought about the function I was building, was to ensure it was set up for success beyond me, that I wasn't that single point of failure. And that's something that I care about a lot, is being able to create something that's sustainable and that people's attention and effort is directed towards things with the highest impact, the highest value, and that we also let robots do what robots do best.
Just do stuff, and particularly if it's replicable. And this is where I get all fired up personally, is you understand the nature of the work and what we're trying to do with people analytics. And you mentioned the experience at Google and GitHub and other places. However, there are CHROs or heads of talent that haven't grown up, with this discipline. And so, both based on your experience and what you see in the world, how do you educate leaders who are resourcing people analytics functions so you actually have what's necessary to create this ongoing capability? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, a couple of thoughts come to mind. I think that some folks that I've chatted with, they have this issue of being able to get that buy-in, that investment around people analytics, or even this desire to make decisions based on the data they serve up. For better or worse, in my career, I haven't run into that issue. I've run into the opposite issue of people wanting to make too many decisions based on data that might even be a little bit too limited to justify making that decision yet. And I think that's where a real point of education is needed in a lot of cases, that we have so many people who are excited about data, they're seeing the power of data, but sometimes there isn't as much of that background around, what data are reliable, what data should you actually be making decisions based on. So that's where I actually see a lot of opportunity for education. At the same time, something I always like to say is that I want to share some of my perspective with CHROs, with stakeholders, but I also learn so much from them. I always like to
Mhm.
say that, hey, being in people analytics, a little bit by design, I am blind. I am focused on the data part of the story. And there's so many parts of the story that are not easily measurable, that are easily quantifiable, or even in our databases, that our HRBPs, the CHROs, they just have that in their head. So I always like
Mhm.
to say, whenever I identify sort of an insight in the data that I find surprising, and I bring it towards an HRBP or a head of talent or a head of HR, one of us is going to learn something. Either it's going to be surprising to them, or they're going to teach me about why it isn't surprising to them, and I'm going to learn some context about the organization. Longer term, um, uh, I just want to say that I think that a lot of people analytics teams, they build these internal resources, and they might not be getting that buy-in or that use from the CHROs, and they're concerned about sort of the interest in data. My personal perspective, this is a little bit of self-blaming, is that that's the responsibility of a people analytics function to make that resource useful, to make it something that is an efficient use of their time. And if you're not seeing that, then that's a real opportunity to really rethink how you're approaching it.
Yeah, I there's so many things that I'd like to dig deeper on in what you shared. Just for example, the need to create new data or being aware of the limitations of the data, the governance processes by which to consume the data, what stories need to be told, like myth busting and affirming and things like that. So just to tee up some of the things that we're going to talk about today, but I want to ask you, this is that when you are interacting with executives, having this open mind, being open to rethink things, to coin what Adam Grant has put forth in his book, is the idea that we need to understand as people analytics professionals what is in the heads of our internal customers, how they think, and those hypotheses in turn get tested or and validated or busted up. Is that how you interact to set the stage for the kind of business readiness, if you will, for the insights that you're generating? If not, what are some of the nuances there?
Yeah, for sure. I'm definitely of that mind. Actually, I have a personal journey right now around learning more about sort of the core financials of business, because I truly believe that HR has somewhat of a practice of getting a little bit siloed sometimes and thinking very much in HR sense. And I think that realistically, there's you know there's other ways that you can talk about these same metrics that might be even more accessible to leaders who come from different domains. So I'm a
Mhm.
big fan of meeting people where they're at. And admittedly, I've definitely not done that well at certain points in my career where I get so excited about the data. I want to talk about all the little nuances. Um, but I always take a step back and think, okay, what are these people's priorities? What are they thinking about? What's keeping them up at night? And how can data inform how they think about it? And that's a key difference for me. And I sort of alluded to this before, is that I'm a big fan of data informed decision making and not data driven decision making,
Mhm.
because there's that whole quote, I'm going to misquote it, of not everything is valuable is easily measured, and not everything that's easily measured is valuable, right? Um, so I think that people analytics teams realistically have a lot of work oftentimes to engaging with their stakeholders and making sure that the resources they build aren't in a silo. And that's something, again, that I've struggled with and I've had to put a lot of work in around. But something I come back to is that I want to build things that are useful, that people actually, look at, that they actually use. And when that isn't the case, that is teaching me that I need to do something different.
Yeah. Let's pick up on that point because I love what you said about being data informed. And there's so much information hitting executives, HR business partners, everyone around the organization, people, leaders who would be consuming our dashboards, reports, insights, and for appropriate action. So there's this uh, dilemma where, well, we don't want to overwhelm them, but we don't want to not have them consume the insight that could really be helpful, not only for team productivity, but for employee well-being and all these other, inclusion, all these other good things. So can you speak to how you market your capability and insights, within your internal stakeholder, your internal customers?
Yeah. Um, so let's talk about building a people analytics function. These are things that I've learned over time, and this is also
Hmm.
comes from mistakes that I've made around it. I used to think that the best way to launch sort of people analytics capabilities, let's say dashboards, is to launch everything at once, and have this big old sort of party, this big old smash. And then I realized that really didn't help in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Yes, people got some excitement around it, but realistically, everyone was coming at the space of not knowing about how to deal with these at the base. even myself, as you know, at GitHub, oftentimes I was sort of the sole person who was handling this. I would get overwhelmed at a specific time. So when I think about actually building people analytics capabilities, both from a bandwidth perspective and also from a, you know, getting this acclimated to the business perspective, I'm a big fan of starting small and with a specific part of the life cycle. So I'm a
Mm.
big fan of saying, okay, let's say we need to do this new dashboard or this new data infrastructure. I want to identify, okay, what is a high value kind of space where people have big questions right now that aren't being served? Maybe that's talent acquisition and speed of hire or something like that. Um, I want to spend a lot of energy to build that dashboard up and to really work with my stakeholders. And then I want to launch that to what I call champions. And this is a silly term, but it's those people who, they're already excited about data. They're already asking about it. I want to pilot that with them first. Work through all the bugs. I don't want everyone to come to me at once and give all the same bugs. It's oftentimes you can get them from one person. And then after we've gone through that process, I'm going to launch more broadly to that team. And that person that was that champion is now going to be basically a secondary to me. They're going to be able to help their peers with these data products and be able to even explain it better than me sometimes because they're coming from the same place. Now, after I do that, I want to use that experience, that particular dashboard of those outcomes, as kind of like a walking deck for other parts of the organization, saying, "Hey, here's what we did for talent acquisition. Here's what we did for speed to hire. What are you curious about?" And that's really what I found to be the most scalable kind of process when I go through that timeline.
Well, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Easier said than done, of
Mm.
course. And the idea that once you start getting these champions on board, building credibility, yeah, how do you, in your experience and from your network
Mm.
of fellow people analytics practitioners, how do you get more resources for additional headcount, for technology? What's that look like?
Yeah, great. So I'll talk about technology and headcount differently. So for technology, I think it comes down to people hours as saying, okay, I could do this myself manually and take this amount of time, or we have this automated. I ran into the case like this with, hey, when I started at GitHub, a lot of our data infrastructure was actually quite manual. I was actually manually sort of pulling things from APIs and the like, doing some R scripts to basically massage the data and then linking it to Tableau. And then I was sending screenshots of visualizations. And naturally, there's a lot of time that was being spent there that could have been spent elsewhere. So I think that bring it back to the bandwidth around what you can do, and then what bandwidth could get opened up with a product. I think it also comes back to the experience. It wasn't a great experience for all of our stakeholders to have to reach out to me every single time to get a simple image of headcount every week, something like that, right? So because of that, I was able to essentially say, hey, here's how data visualization, here's how Tableau could actually solve that need of having the data available when someone wants to look into it. And here's how this data infrastructure product, I actually like using a product called Databricks, could really help automate some of these data pipelines. So I think
Mhm.
that at the end of the day, companies I find are actually very generous in the people hours they are going to throw at something, and a little bit stingy sometimes in actually buying products. But when you can make a really strong business case of, okay, here's the salary, and this is how much time it's being taken, and here's even the capability, the additional capability we'd be able to offer if we were to get this product. I think that helps a lot. Now, when we actually get
Yeah.
to the headcount piece, I'm actually a big fan of not hunting for headcount. What I like to do is I like to build progressively. So we just talked about my process of, okay, we're going to build capabilities, we're going to make that walking deck, and then we're going to see who else wants things built. From there might be let's say 5 different products that people want built, and I will go to my stakeholders, to them, and I'll say, okay, I understand we need these built. Here's the timeline I can build those on myself. And if they say, oh, we would like that a little bit sooner, I say, well, that's outside of my capacity, but that's a conversation then around a longer term resource or a shorter term resource like a contractor to help supplement and get quicker to that endpoint. I think that at the end of the day, it's very much kind of, you need to make sure that you've sold something before you add more people around it. So I'm very big fan of going back from the priorities and the timelines, and then seeing if that informs a resourcing decision.
Yeah, and we've known each other for years now, and I just love the way you think. I just say that out loud. Because what you just described is the way, frankly, I think about
Mm,
it. And not to say that it's right or wrong, but effectively, I just want to get back to this idea of understanding capacity because we're all constrained by time. And so I was saying that if we are a CHRO, if I'm a CHRO, and I understand that there's this need to develop a people analytics capability, I can hire someone such as yourself who's done it before, and there can be an incremental build. And then there's this case, particularly in healthcare, where I don't have time for an incremental build. I need to do something different. I need kind of a life hack for my business. I need to just, do things differently. And then it invites the question, how do I, prioritize, the systems, the people and technologies and so forth? Because many CHROs and heads of talent, whomever's going to commission this work and champion it, they don't have a background in people analytics and IO psychology and HR tech. So my pointed question to you is, if I am going to like really lean into this and invest in people analytics and workforce planning and do things differently, how would you coach them on the best first step or maybe first couple steps?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great question, right? And I think, what comes in my head, is that, I've looked at a lot of job postings for the first people analytics hire, and I don't really trust them very much. As in, what is being asked for is often very different from what I perceive, they might need. And that's again because this is a lot of folks' first sort of stab at this. So when I run into those situations, I don't care too much about what they're asking for. I come in and I say, here's what I can provide. Are you looking for somebody to handle this, to build a people analytics function from the ground up? And if so, here's what resources I would need in order to do that. And here would be my approach. Now, when I think about somebody who's just coming and they want to build a people analytics function. It's funny, as you know, Al, I wrote a blog post about this maybe about a couple of months ago because people analytics is exploding. I think a lot of it is driven by this great reallocation of talent. Other people call it great resignation. Is that companies are really learning that if they do not have a data informed perception on their talent, they're going to be behind. And where I used to see companies hire at 1,000, I think that these days they're hiring at 300, 100 even.
Mm-hmm.
But because of that, there ends up being situations where companies want to invest in this before they know even what they might want to do with it, right? They're saying, oh, everyone's doing people analytics. We need to do people analytics so we don't get left behind. But what do we actually want as an outcome from it? So what I think about is, I think that there's two routes to sort of start investing in people analytics capabilities. One is to hire somebody, preferably somebody who's done it before, and will sort of outline their vision for how they could build up these capabilities. I think that oftentimes generalists, people who have a wide variety of experiences, end up being helpful. And at the end of the day, you need to be open to somebody saying, here's how I would build this, and not be focused too much on what you have in your head. So that's one piece of advice I would give. The second piece would be, hey, do you actually need a person yet? And that's actually a key question. This is, somewhat, if I want to build things internally for people analytics functions, kind of, fighting against myself. But I have a long habit of doing this. But realistically, I think that there's a lot of companies who are hiring for their first people analytics person that realistically could be better served by getting a product. And when I think about products that could really help early stage startups around people analytics capabilities, I do think about a company called Equitable. It's actually run by a couple of my friends, sort of Gabe and Joseph and Ethan. And they essentially do a people analytics dashboard in a box. They handle all the integrations. They set up that dashboard for you to look at, and they work with folks on it. And for me, I think, wow, what they provide out of box is what took me, years to actually build. And I love that build. It was so exciting for me to go through that. But when I think about that quickness, that speed of getting that insight, I think that's a great first step. Even if you don't use a product like that longer term, it gets you an idea for your handle on your data. I also think about, let's say when companies, one of the major use cases is actually, hiring and quality of hire. How are we doing with respect to our hiring? And that's hard work. I'm an IO psychologist, industrial organizational psychologist by training, and actually looking at your hiring system to see if it's actually working effectively is not an easy thing, especially when oftentimes our applicant tracking systems like Greenhouse are siloed from our human resources information systems like our Workdays. There is an upcoming startup I've been keeping an eye on called Searchlight that is doing a lot of this sort of work that's really looking at that quality of hire. It's really automating that quality of hire for companies. And then, as you know, I have my own startup around this space, but I won't talk about it too much yet. But realistically, I would really encourage companies to think, how much do we really need to reinvent the wheel here at this stage of our company life cycle versus leveraging what other folks have learned from other companies and dealing with that a little bit more set up kind of product.
Yeah, absolutely love it. And I wanted to talk about your product here in a bit. And I also want to talk about the process by which you went through to identify that there was that need. But before we do that, I want to talk about what you just touched on, where, you can secure a technology, but what do you think too for the role of outsourced providers for people analytics? And I'm not going to jump into names because then I'm going to forget somebody and then I'm going to get in trouble. But there is a case where it's not the core competitive advantage of an organization to create a people analytics function and hire, retain, enable all that stuff. And there can be, particularly in this day and age, working with a partner that is their core competency to make sure that they're hiring the right people, enabling them with the right technologies. And effectively, now you're writing a check in large part to a third party. Now, that does not mean that we don't need somebody in an organization to interact, facilitate, package, do that, relationship management within an organization. But what are your thoughts as we evolve in a people analytics workforce planning practice, the role of these outsourced providers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you know, Al, even at your conference a couple of years ago, I did a whole talk on how much I love building versus buying. And there were some companies that are like, but realistically, my stance has softened, quite a bit on that. And the reason is that, again, I think that companies are investing in people analytics earlier to the point that they just need those foundations. And I think that I even reflected on myself and I thought, yes, I personally like the idea of building it all myself. I just like that. I like the idea of being able to understand every single point of my infrastructure of where the data are happening. I think I had some poor early experiences with some products where I felt like they were a little bit black box, where they'd say, okay, we're going to set up your data. We're going to make this great integrity, but we're not going to tell you how we do it. We're not going to tell you how we deal with null values. We're not going to do these things. And for me, from my perspective, that constrains my ability to serve my stakeholders. If a number looks wrong, how am I going to audit that? So as I reflected, I think it really comes down to let's say a speed versus flexibility kind of value proposition. I think that realistically, with a lot of these, I'll even call them more boilerplate products, which are great, and that's not to say anything wrong about them, is that they have learned what works for 80% of companies. They even have best practices, ways of quantifying a lot of these metrics that are valuable to actually get. And I think that 90% of companies, when they're starting their first people analytics function, I would actually say, let's say if they're under 1,000 people, would do well to buy one of those products, if only to understand their data better. I think that where those products start to not be as good is when you scale up and you need more flexibility. You need to create these custom metrics. You need to, get outside of the typical data structures. You need to really understand and do some weird things like randomization around it. So when I think about the build versus buy, I think about how quickly do you need to have these capabilities? And I also think about how much customization do you truly need to provide that first level of value? Because to rebuild, to reinvent that wheel again, and I'm someone who's done this, it's so much fun. And that's for me, but I think I'm a little bit weird sometimes. But it's a long journey, realistically. And there's going to be a lot of cases where you are running the same formula that another company has built before, and it doesn't make sense from a financial perspective. So that's not really how I think about build versus buy.
Well, I'm happy you're saying that, because you talk about the need for speed. I was trying to avoid saying that, but it's true given what's happening in the world today and the need to hire, retain, and you can't spend, have a 12-month roadmap in many cases to get the value needs to be delivered within, a matter of months. And you are obviously a creator. You get things done. You see, identify need and you fill it. Fantastic. I want to get to your product in a second, but before, it dawned on me as you were sharing that we're talking the same language. We've been in the field for a while, and so I see so many HR tech products, and even outside of HR, talking about their analytics value propositions. So everything from the core HR to an ATS to a learning platform, they all have their analytics module or analytic capability. So it creates a lot of noise, arguably, for the buyer. So I just want to back up and just ask you, what is people analytics to you? How are you defining it? What are some of the boundaries that you put up just so you can understand it, you can communicate that understanding to others?
Yeah. I got some other thoughts as I was talking as well, but I'll answer your question first. And that's that, how do I think about people analytics and how I describe my work, right? I think about people analytics as any meaningful aggregation of people data. That's how I really think about it. And I think the core there are aggregation. So I think that people analytics, and again, in other companies, people analytics also has reporting under it. But in my experiences, usually that's handled more by the let's say the Workday team or the like to actually do the roll-up information. So I think about, okay, that aggregation piece, and then what's meaningful? How do you surface to decision makers what is a meaningful difference, something that is actionable, that they actually want to do something at? And I think that a lot of companies out there are very, very good at the aggregation piece. I don't think very many companies are great at the meaningful piece, at being able to surface what might be something worth making a decision based on. And you were mentioning this before, that we have so many different systems, so many different metrics and data coming in, and it's an ocean. Like, where do you even look? And it's somewhat arbitrary where you're going to look with respect to this. So I'm a big fan of the meaningful piece, and that comes from a lot of work and a little bit of inferential statistics and the like. But I also think the other piece that I thought of, Al, was that there's a lot of tools out there that, again, they might be an applicant tracking system or a human resources information system. A lot of their goals these days is to create in-product analytics. They're creating their own dashboards, their own views. I will come out as saying that 9 times out of 10, I don't find those views useful. And the reason is because they're assuming that you are using their product in the way that you expect or that they expect. And oftentimes you are not. You're making a different assumption in your hiring process than they are. And that's going to bring all of your insights out of whack. And I cannot count how many times I've had people come up to me saying, oh, how do these data make sense in our applicant tracking system or in Workday, these aggregations? And I say, I don't know. I really don't. It seems like they're making these assumptions. So something I would love to see from more of these vendors is less building their internal people analytics capabilities or their internal analytics dashboards, and more about building ways to easily get the data out of their systems into some centralized place. I think that's the goal for people analytics. I don't think you want to be working in your source systems. Rather, you want to have really great APIs, really great, ways of getting the data out, such that you can unlock that new level of capability. Because at the end of the day, companies are going to assume how you work with your data, but only some companies will actually really work with you to actually understand what assumptions you're making and how they can tailor their product to help with that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, this notion of interoperability and still maintaining privacy and ethics is something I want to touch on as we get towards the end here. But what I want to talk about is your product, because you are thinking next step. Not to say this is like 3-5 years out. You just have identified some gaps in the processes that you would like to fill. So with that as a setup, what are you working on now?
Yeah, for sure. And, Al, as I was talking about earlier today, this product is very much solving for myself. And if I think about, okay, a lot of my work at GitHub, and a lot of work that, other folks did at GitHub is, okay, we have dashboards, and everyone is thinking about dashboards as this North Star. This is the place we want to get. We want to have this dashboard where we can get all the information we want. And I get that for companies that don't have that right now, that is such a great thing to work towards. And I think that dashboards really fulfill their promise of being able to serve up insights that you are looking for when you're actively seeking to see, okay, is the attrition rate of engineering higher in May compared to August or something like that. Dashboards are so amazing for doing. They're very much oriented towards that flexibility and that exploration. At the same time, I think that dashboards are very poor at the surfacing of insights you are not thinking about. I don't know about you, Al, but when I think about dashboards in my head is that's also a promise that it was always there, that you're just going to magically find these insights, these rich, deep insights that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. But I think that because we orient so much towards the flexibility of dashboards, all these different filters, realistically, it would take, so much time to look at all those different breakdowns, all those different filters across those different timestamps to actually find those insights. So my product is basically saying, we don't need people to do that. We have machines that probably much better than ourselves can look through those kind of differences across time, across groups, and surface what might be a meaningful insight. And it's solving for myself, being that person who is looking click by click in those filters, trying to find those. And again, it's a losing kind of proposition because 90% of the time, people data are pretty stable. They're going to stay the same, time over time or across groups. And because of that, you really, need to find that needle in a haystack. So what my product does, it's called peopledatabot, is that it automatically surfaces those insights. And it also goes to where you already work. I think that I cannot count how many times I've had folks not look at dashboards just because they forget how to get to that separate space. They forget how to get to the Tableau or the Power BI or the like. And I think that realistically, someone also needs to remember that, I should go check this dashboard. And even then, even if they do remember and they do know how to check, that's also extra work to sign into those places and the like. And again, I think that's friction that we don't need right now. And especially HR folks are so overworked in so many places. So my product also surfaces those little insights automatically in Slack, in Teams, in email. And again, says, hey, you wanted to keep track of your attrition rate. And you said that you wanted to know if it went down or went up by 5%. That happened. Here's what seems to be driving it. Here's a link to a dashboard where you can explore further. So that's pretty much the gist of it.
Yeah, I'm smiling because it takes away that arguably fun part, but also anguishing part of doing analytics, because you are exploring, you're going, oh God, that looks cool. However, is that the most valuable activity of an analyst? No, it's not. unearthing that and then packaging it and communicating it out either through an automated form, as you're talking about, or through conversation and storytelling, that is immeasurably more valuable, to an organization. So I certainly celebrate what you're doing. Although I got to be honest, I really enjoyed that aspect of the, exploration, discovery, applying the logic, but a robot is going to do it much, much better than me, and particularly at scale, at speed, when you have so many scenarios. So that's what I was curious about as you were sharing that. Is that how is it programmed? How are the thresholds identified? Is that company to company? Is that set by the individual? Is that set by the people analytics leader? What is that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. That's another key part of the product, actually, is that, I could build the Tableau dashboard right now, and I could color code it. And I could say, oh, you wanted to have, whatever attrition rate was above, this percentage, that is going to be color coded in red. You can do that right now. But that's assuming that everybody needs to be informed at the same level of difference. And I don't think that's true. I think that an HRBP, for example, or a human resources business partner is going to want to hear about, let's say, a 1 or 2% difference in attrition rate, whereas a CHRO, they might only need to hear about a 5% difference in attrition rate. So the product is very much built such that each individual user can set their own limits and their own sort of preferences around what would be a meaningful difference for them on this metric. And then the bot is going to automatically surface things to them and personalize it. Because again, I think that we, for too long, have taken a one-size-fits-all approach to dashboarding and these insights. And realistically, stakeholders at different levels need different amounts of information and have different triggers at which a data change or difference is meaningful.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, I'm just envisioning actually using something like that, because I don't want to, okay, it's Friday and I set a reminder for myself to go look at the dashboard, but I have so many other things going on, something built up, I got to respond there. And if I go there, what am I really looking for? Am I just going to, okay, attrition go up, or, what's the purpose? But if I have the confidence that something is going to get elevated to me, if it is in fact a concern, then I don't have to spend that time, doing that, discovery. So no, I certainly appreciate the value proposition. One of the things that I would be remiss in, if I did not bring it up, is the notion of ethics and what I call responsible use. Because as you have these exception reporting, or for lack of a better term, to say, something that gets pushed, it invites the question, what is getting pushed? What's the underlying data? And where are the boundaries? One of the roles, arguably, and I'd be interested in your thoughts of a people analytics leader, is to understand when to say no and for what purpose. So can you talk a little bit about your view of ethics and how a people analytics leader has a role in identifying the boundaries and saying
no?
Exactly.
I think that I also think we're getting into sort of data governance territory, right? It's also who should see what, and are there places where we might not want to make a decision based on something, right? Even if other things would suggest that. So when I think about data governance, first things first, I'll say that in any sort of chat or email or the like, any identity that would be with sort of the peopledatabot product, you can have those role-based access kind of set up for that. But when we actually think about data governance, who do you choose? Who sees what? That's a big process. And I always say that at GitHub, one of my best friends was our data privacy counsel. We chatted all the time around this because it's meaningful, right? And I think that what I always come back to is, what is the minimum amount of data that somebody needs to see in order to make a business decision? So as an example, I think about, does a HR ops person, do they need to see information about people's gender or ethnicity in a rich way? Maybe not. They might have a use of seeing that information of aggregate, but not the individual names. In contrast, there might be some legitimate cases where an HRBP and human resources business partner, they might have legitimate use case to see those individual sort of gender, ethnicity, where in order to sort of investigate something or to work with people to protect their stakeholders. So I always come back to what is the information that is necessary for people to do their jobs well and to serve their stakeholders, and where is the information that we need to really protect that's personally identifiable, that might be a sensitive topic. The example I always give, and this is actually quite relevant around kind of data infrastructure, because I think that a lot of people analytics teams, when they start out, they actually tag on to more general data infrastructure around the databases and like. Unfortunately, a lot of those databases don't have role-based access control yet. So anybody who has access to that will be able to see everything in there. And I even say myself, hey, I want to set up barriers for myself to come across information that I don't need to see. I don't need to see someone's self-identified sexual orientation. That's their own information. I might aggregate that at some point if there's a business case to look at that for an employee resource group or the like. But I want to set up those protections in place. Now, when I think about the second part of the question, which is very much around, okay, what if we find an insight? Where's the limit around what we should actually do with these data? And I think about, are we serving the employees and the company at the end of the day? Are we getting towards where we want to be? I think a lot about actually ethics in machine learning, because in machine learning, we are essentially looking at the past and we're replicating in the future. If you think about a lot of companies, when they look at, and this has happened at larger companies, if you don't think about the people that in a special way, you're going to see, okay, let's look at the highest performers in an organization and let's work back from that to see who we should hire. But if you don't add the right controls, you might end up just replicating being a white male, which is unfortunate, right? But obviously there's certain groups of people who have had many, headwind or tailwinds that have helped them get to a certain place. And if we don't add the right controls, we're going to replicate that same structure, and we're not going to give the opportunity for other people who can contribute a lot to make those contributions. So I think that you always need to bear in mind for this insight, if we're going to make a decision based on this, an action, we're going to hire differently, we're going to promote differently, I really advocate for looking at adverse impact. If we were to take this approach, if we were to change this hiring process, if we look at our past data, would that have changed the ratios of people that were hired in a way that we might not like? I'm also a fan, again, of being data informed and not data driven. And again, there are some places, I talk about this use case where, let's say that you have a business, and in your business, specifically, you're selling to an area of the world that might have certain biases. In that situation, your salespeople who don't come from, let's say, a white male background, will legitimately do poor in that scenario. But does that mean they're not doing the right things? No, right? And it's important to think about. And we can talk about this all day around it, but realistically, I think that these are people at the end of the day. We always need to bring ourselves back to it. We get excited about the day, we think about it. I always get excited about these things, but I always need to bring myself back and say, these are people. And when we make decisions about them, we're impacting people's lives. And we need to think about, what kind of company do we want to be? How do we want our philosophy to be represented in our decisions? And there are some places where I actually proactively advocate that you don't take the pure data-driven route, because that will lead you down a path of, again, continuing to have barriers for people who've had barriers for far too long.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you for saying that. And it's like, amen. Just like, this is something that is not broadly understood outside the people analytics field. And I think I and others, that we need to do better in communicating that out, to understand that, hey, because there's a reluctance, there's this fear, there's an anxiety. Oh, you're studying people, you're doing research projects on people. Do they know it? Are you being transparent? And all. yes, you need to communicate it. You need to be transparent. At the same time, to your point, this has a virtuous purpose behind it. As I've long said, not only do we have an opportunity to do right by the employee, by the worker, we have a
Mm.
responsibility to do so, and the business value downstream from that has proven to be evident throughout the past 20 plus years. So I'm excited about where the field is going. It is growing. So a few more questions before we wrap, because I could talk to you all day, because you started to touch on unconscious bias and potentially bias and the algorithms and the data and so forth. But I want to ask you, back to the technologies, like there's a bunch of listening employee experience vendors out there, and they're collecting data that at a heightened level of frequency. It's sometimes new data. So that is my question. What new data do you think we are in this place we're able to create new, more appropriate data to answer the questions leaders want or need to know? Or does the data that we need already,
Mm.
exist? What are
That's a
your
great
thoughts?
question. My first answer to that question will be that I think that companies who are just starting out should focus on the basics. Should really understand the core kind of stuff that's going to come out of your human resources information system, like your Workday or your Bamboo, and out of your applicant tracking system, like your Greenhouse or your Lever. I think that a lot of times companies can get a little bit distracted when they're early in their journeys in chasing these really cool, shiny things. Beyond that, do I think there are valuable data sets that go outside of the general kind of space? For sure. And those I get extra excited about. Actually, I did an entire talk on non-traditional data sets. One of my sort of experiences around this was, we had a question around sort of some competition and around even sort of the scope of WeWorks that, it would be able to serve us. And we didn't actually have a data set around it. And I ended up just web scraping that information. I'm actually a big fan of web scraping to see, okay, what information is actually readily available online and in consistent formats that we can just get that and then we can compare that. I'm also a fan of dealing, again, and you need to be very careful around privacy around this, but in aggregate, with badge data. I think that we're coming out of, hopefully, this pandemic, and we're getting this whole return to the office kind of space. One of my earliest projects at GitHub actually was looking at employee performance and other outcomes like attrition and the like, comparing folks who came into the office a lot versus didn't come into the office because they weren't forced to come into the office. And long story short, the outcome was actually that there were better outcomes for slightly better outcomes for the company, for the employees who didn't come into the office all the time, which is not what the stakeholders were expecting. The board was specifically trying to force GitHub to have more folks in the office. And by surfacing those data from the badge, people coming in and out of the office, we were to say, hey, this actually really works for GitHub. This really works for our company, and the like. So I think that when you have that strong use case, here's how I describe it. When you have that strong use case, and it's really a problem that you don't feel can be readily served by the data that you have, seek out those data for sure. At the same time, make sure that ask is a strong priority and that you're not avoiding or missing so much lower hanging fruit that is already existing in your data sets. I think that there's a lot of cool additional signals that are coming out. As you say, continuous listening and the like. When I think about continuous listening, the first thing that I say is that survey not based on how much you can get that information, but how much you can act on that information. Because otherwise, folks aren't going to see the value prop of it.
Right. Yeah. And it could be counterproductive to your point. Absolutely. Yeah. So as we fast forward over time, where do you see the space going?
Yeah. I think that people analytics, right now it's that shiny new thing. Like, again, like you and I, yourself even more than myself, have been working this space for a while. And I think that you've also seen so much new energy and how much this is taking off right now. I think that energy is amazing, but we're going to get towards more of that space of this is expected. This is what a modern organization has, is a people analytics function. And I think that we're going to get more towards doing some similar thing, having some standards and talking more, and it being less of that scrappy little community around it. I think it's going to be more like, hey, we're kind of like a product analytics function, because again, people are such an important input to the organization's success. So I do really see the space getting more towards that place of not being that shiny new kid on the block, and more being an important part of organizations. I think that the risk and my fear in that case is that we just keep to what's expected and what we've always done in that kind of space, and stop innovating, stop trying new things. As I said, my entire product, peopledatabot, is about, again, I think that most companies have sort of said, oh, we are going to, in our people analytics function, go for what we've seen in our marketing function, in our data function. They just get these dashboards and that's what they use. And what I'm saying is that I think that once people analytics gets to that space of, again, being that expectation, we don't need to limit ourselves to what other analytics functions are doing. We don't need to just copy that. We can go above and beyond. Because we have a really, really interesting set of data. I always like to say people data are messy, and that's what makes them fun. And it very much is a different perspective. So I think that would be my hope for the future of people analytics functions, is that even though we're going to become more expected, more consistent, I hope that we keep on innovating. We keep on trying new things and learning from it. Because again, people decisions are so impactful, and that's such a heavy responsibility for us. And at the end of the day, I don't want us to get complacent.
Yeah. I'm smiling because number one, I really am hopeful towards that end, that I view us as a discipline as electricians. So, we're always going to need electricity, but there's only one plug in our organizational wall right now in many cases. Some don't even have plugs, they're going by candlelight. But there's going to be a lot of plugs around the house, as there are most houses, and the efficiency and effectiveness of that delivery mechanism, as well as the power that you get out of it, is going to improve over time. But I am fearful a little bit that it's going to be taken for granted, and that the electricians, like plumbers, are underappreciated, and they just assume, hey, it should work, because it does take work, and it is a creative discipline, and you've done some outstanding work, and I'm so excited for your product to get out there and people to adopt it, because that, for lack of a better term, the way I'm interpreting is like exception reporting that's delivered, on time, and, so you can actually, to your earlier point too, act on it. And that's where it happens. If we're doing this work and there's no action taking place, then it begs the question, why are we doing it at all?
For sure. And I think you mentioned earlier, like, there's that element of exploration, and exploration is fun. And I do that as well. And I think that, peopledatabot definitely wouldn't prevent that. In fact, it's about saying, here are the cool places where you might want to explore, where you can find some extra interesting things when you do explore. And I think that, again, realistically, it's about that first filter and that surfacing and the like. And the thing I think about as well is that I myself am biased. I myself am biased of where I want to look and what I'm excited about, what I'm interested in. And that's a realistic problem. And that's why I actually always called out in my people analytics work, is that I'm coming from my own place. I have my own interests in, this result versus another. But here's what the data are showing me around it. And that's where I really come to it. But again, I want us to keep on being those innovators. I keep on want us to be that scrappy kind of function, and to not sort of be taken for granted. And again, for us to take our situations for granted as sort of the people who have done this for a while. But again, I keep on seeing from the field, there's so much excitement. There's so many great new talent. Al, I still think of myself as that new kid on the block sometimes. And I realize I'm really not anymore. I'm getting older, Al.
Exactly. Welcome to the club. Embrace.
But there's so much great new energy, and I think that I think that sometimes we might have a bias towards sort of saying, here's what we have done historically. Here's sort of the best practices. And I think that ourselves, as people who have been in this space for a while, we really need to open ourselves up for people who are newer and have new ideas that realistically might serve the needs of the organization in ways that we can't even imagine, because we came up in a different sort of space of the workplace. So it's just so much fun.
Amen. Absolutely, amen. And that's I cannot emphasize that point enough. So there needs to be an openness, not only among people analytics leaders who've been around for a while, but CHROs and others who are going to be commissioning this work, is that their idea of what's going to work might not be appropriate given the realities of today and the capabilities of the technologies and the creativity of the people that are in the field. So no, I think that's a really, really important point. So thank you for voicing it. So as we start to wrap, I mean, how can people learn more about you and what
Yeah,
you're
for sure.
doing?
I'm very active on LinkedIn. I do a good amount of posts there, so feel free to check me out there. It's Jared Valdron. That's JaredValdron. Beyond that, I have a website for peopledatabot. It's just how it sounds. You can look that up. I have a little demo there. And again, reach out. Chat. Happy to learn more about what y'all are doing. And I think that, again, I also have a bit of a practice. And again, comes back to my automation of things, in that sometimes people will ask me questions. I say, I've written a blog on that. Here you go. And that sort of helps around that. But again, it's also me getting feedback for what I've written to see, okay, do I need to do an edit on this? Is there something that's missing around it? Yeah, that's how to reach out. And then beyond that, I'm hoping to get out to conferences again soon. So
Yeah, I
I'm
hope
hoping to
so.
see some additional folks there.
Yeah, we'll make it happen. And Jared, man, I gotta compliment you. Congratulations on what you've achieved. I love that you are a learner. I love that you're a creator and you're a giver. And it's just fun to be around. So thanks. Keep doing the great work, and we'll talk soon, hopefully in person.
Yeah, for sure. And Al, I want to thank you for all you do for the people analytics community. And again, I know it's been sort of a tough couple of years in general for a lot of folks who love those in-person experiences. And I think that what you've been able to do in sort of keeping that community going, despite everything that the world is going through, it's so exciting. And I'm so glad that and hopeful that we're gonna meet up again on this flip side.
Yeah, we will. But thank you for that. Yeah, I really appreciate it. All right, my friend, you be well, and we'll talk again soon. Yeah.
Sounds good. Cheerio.
Thank you for listening today. If you want to learn more about today's guest, go to pafal.net. You'll be able to see links to the bio as well as to the video of today's program. You'll also have the chance to support this podcast and other shows that we do by becoming a Pafal community member. You can also donate if you choose. What will be helpful to support Pafal, the People Data for Good movement, and me will be to share this episode with friends and coworkers and others who might find it valuable. Finally, for updates on upcoming episodes, shows, and events, please subscribe to our newsletter at pafal.net. At the bottom, you can also see our social media presence. So please subscribe to our company page on LinkedIn, follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. We're active as can be, and we want to provide this content to you that is timely, relevant, and actionable. So again, thank you for listening today, and hope to see you soon. I also want to give a shout out to Jenna Dern, Malaz El Sheikh, and Sarah Sparnan, who without them, this show would not happen. And now go out and make some great things happen.